base officially became Fort Ord in 1940, when the 7th Infantry Division was activated under the command of General Joseph W. Stilwell. In Order Number 7 of the War Department, 15,809 acres near Monterey, California, they called Camp Ord, was renamed Fort Ord. But the history of Fort Ord started much earlier. In 1846, during the war with Mexico, Commodore John D. Sloat, commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, landed a small, unopposed force of Marines in Monterey Bay and claimed the territory and the Presidio for the United States. Monterey would become the capital of Alta, California. They moved the location of the fort and began improving defenses to protect the town and the harbor. This new fort was named Fort Mervine in honor of Captain William Mervine, who commanded one of the ships in Sloat's squadron. Later, soldiers from Battery F, 3rd Artillery, replaced these Marines as the garrison force. Two of the company's officers, Lieutenants Edward O.C. Ord and William Tecumseh Sherman, were to achieve fame as Union generals in the Civil War. Fort Mervine continued to be manned by a small garrison until the Mexican War ended and gold was discovered in California. Units of the fort were disbanded, and most of the soldiers headed for the gold fields. Army troops again occupied the fort at Monterey during the Civil War, and in 1898, the 15th Infantry Regiment, returning from duty in the Philippines, was headquartered here. The fort, which had been known at various times as Fort Halleck, Ord Barracks, Monterey Barracks, and Fort Stockton, was officially redesignated the Presidio of Monterey in 1904 in honor of the original Spanish fort. From 1904 to 1910, a school of musketry operated on the post, and a school for Army cooks and bakers was located here from 1910 to 1917. The area that was to become Fort Ord began as a maneuver area and target range for the 11th Cavalry and 76th Horse-Drawn Field Artillery, then stationed at the Presidio. The 30th Infantry Regiment from San Francisco also used the area, as did Reserve and National Guard units. Soldiers would arrive from Monterey by Southern Pacific Railroad at a spur next to the Giggling Barn, named after a German rancher who once owned the land. Tent camps would be set up on land owned by local ranchers. One camp was near the water close to the town of Clayton, another on Huffman's ranch, and another one on Henry J. Hennigan's ranch. Buck, Henry's son, recalls the land was mostly sagebrush, rattlesnakes, and sand dunes. In August of 1917, the Army bought almost 16,000 acres from these ranchers. Records indicate they paid over $10 per acre for scrub brush that in many places was almost impossible to penetrate. A rough dirt road was all that connected East Garrison and the Giggling Railroad spur on Highway 1. The Army called it Giggling Reservation until 1933, when it was officially changed to Camp Ord, in honor of Major General Edward Ortho Cresapt Ord, who had supervised the construction of the fortifications at the Presidio of Monterey back in 1847. In 1938, under the direction of Colonel Homer Groniger, then commanding officer of the Presidio of Monterey, and with the aid of the WPA, a large camp was built about a mile east of the Giggling Railroad spur, and the reservation became a permanent camp. With the outbreak of World War II in Europe in 1938, Fort Ord's total area was increased to over 29,000 acres, with land purchased and donated by local ranchers, 3,000 acres from Tom Work, 2,600 acres in Marina from the Jacks family, and 3,000 acres from the Armstrong family. The 7th Infantry was reactivated under Commanding General Vinegar Joe Stilwell in 1940, becoming the first major unit to occupy the permanent post, and in August of that year the camp was officially renamed Fort Ord. This was wartime, and the WPA, along with private contractors, raced to build concrete mess halls and new wooden barracks in the East Garrison area to get the troops out of tents and mud. Work also began on the $1 Million Soldiers Club overlooking Monterey Bay. This enlisted men's club was a keystone in General Joseph Stilwell's effort to form a cohesive fighting force of the 7th Infantry Division. This club was financed by monthly donations from the soldiers, a WPA grant, and donations from entertainers like Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. It was called the Soldiers Club. It was later named Stilwell Hall in honor of General Vinegar Joe. It was the finest club for enlisted men in the nation. As Esterbrook, Stilwell's daughter, remembers her father's dream of Fort Ord, it would be a very large installation with paved roads, tall buildings, big shade trees, and lots of things for the comfort and amusement of the soldiers. He always wanted them to have the best of everything. Throughout most of World War II, Fort Ord was a major staging area for many combat divisions and units, including the 3rd, 27th, 35th, and 43rd Divisions. The strength at Fort Ord during this time averaged about 35,000 troops, but at one time more than 50,000 troops were on the installation. The 7th Infantry Division initially trained in the Mojave Desert and Camp Pendleton, but in 1943, the 7th Division returned to Fort Ord for final training before being deployed into the Aleutians, the only unit to be sent directly into combat during World War II. One of the soldiers sent to Fort Ord for amphibious training commented, "I thought California was sunshine and warm water. I was wrong about the water. It was cold. But the Monterey Bay was good training for Alaskan combat." The nation and Hollywood rallied behind the war effort. There was a live radio show at Fort Ord on station KRUZ, and dances with big bands and formal balls were held at Stilwell Hall. Fort Ord also served as a detention center for prisoners of war from both the European and Pacific theaters. Prisoners from the Axis nation were interred here from early in 1943 through VE and VJ days in 1945. After the end of the war in 1945, the 7th Infantry Division went to Japan as part of the occupation force. Then in 1946, they returned to Fort Ord for discharge, along with about 800,000 other soldiers and prisoners of war. By 1947, Fort Ord had assumed a slower pace. The 4th Replacement Training Center was activated under Major General Jens Doe and assumed the functions of operating Fort Ord. Shortly thereafter, the 4th Infantry Division was reactivated and given the mission of training replacements for the Army. This mission was to continue through 1949. Downsizing was the big order of the day and was helped in a large part by the Women's Army Corps. More than 100,000 women served in the Army during World War II. In September of 1950, the Korean conflict called a halt to the slow pace. The 4th Infantry Division was transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia, and the 6th Infantry Division was reactivated to replace the 4th and assume the Army training mission at Fort Ord. In late 1951, construction started on more permanent type of barracks, and in 1952, the first family housing units were built in Bayview Park. Also in 1952, Congress passed a law that designated Fort Ord as a permanent Army post. Fort Ord continued its training mission with the 6th Infantry Division as the major command element through 1955. Thousands of soldiers were trained at Fort Ord during the Korean conflict, and 14 former Fort Ord soldiers were recipients of the Congressional Medal of Honor for their actions in combat. Throughout 1955, the 6th Infantry Division conducted basic and advanced infantry training. They also conducted common specialist schools, including clerk, supply, mess, transportation, and communications training. The 5th Infantry Division was assigned to Fort Ord in 1956 under Operation Gyroscope. The 6th Infantry Division was inactivated, and the training mission assumed by the 5th Infantry Division until June 1957, when it too was inactivated. The United States Army Training Center Infantry was then organized to perform the training mission at Fort Ord. Also, CDAC, Combat Development's Command Experimentation Center, was organized to test and evaluate training techniques and equipment. Tragedy struck on September 30th, 1960, when Major General Carl F. Fritchie, the commanding general of Fort Ord, Brigadier General Thomas Hayes, Deputy Commanding General, and 4 other military personnel from Fort Ord were killed when their military aircraft crashed while en route to San Francisco. Fort Ord's Fritchie Army Airfield, with its 3,000-foot-long runway and 8 helipads, is named in memory of the former commander. Fritchie Army Airfield is home base for the division's Combat Aviation Brigade and several smaller aviation units. Numerous aviation, engineer, transportation, medical, and other units were stationed here during the early 60s. Among these were the 52nd Aviation Battalion with the 17th Aviation Company and 33rd Transportation Company, light helicopter, the 84th Engineered Battalion, the 26th Truck Battalion, the 12th Evacuation Hospital, 41st Signal Battalion, 270th Signal Company, 56th Signal Company, 79th Ordnance Company, 573rd Ordnance Company, and the 758th Army Postal Unit. The Combat Aviation Brigade provides air mobility to the division with its UH-1 Huey, its attack capability with AH-1 Cobra and OH-58 Kiowa helicopters. In 1965, the hostilities in Vietnam expanded, and Fort Ord once again became a staging area for units being deployed for combat. Fort Ord continued to conduct infantry training with the emphasis on Southeast Asia. A typical Vietnamese village was constructed at Fort Ord for use in preparing soldiers who eventually saw duty in Vietnam. Various service units were assigned to Fort Ord during this period, including the 613th Engineer Battalion, 301st Transportation Company, and the 54th Military Police Company. The 8th Medical Hospital and 629th Medical Company were assigned here under Operation Reforger. In January 1971, with the end of the draft, Fort Ord became the primary center for the conduct of training under the Experimental Volunteer Army Program. The 70s also saw a continued effort to improve the permanent post facilities. Silas B. Hayes Army Community Hospital grew into a 440-bed facility. Child care facilities were improved, and 7 Monterey County schools operated within the confines of the post. Also improved were the post library, chapel, golf courses, and the post exchange, which was the largest one known at that time. In 1974, the 7th Infantry Division returned to Monterey. The Army Training Center Infantry closed, and Fort Ord became the permanent home of the 7th Infantry Division. In the early 80s, the Secretary of the Army converted the 7th Infantry Division into a prototype light division. This concept reduced its manpower by over 1/3 and eliminated the bulk of its vehicles, creating a highly mobile, rapidly deployable, wholly air transportable division. Major General William Harrison took charge of the new Light Division. On March 16, 1988, the 7th Infantry Division Light had its first test of rapid deployability. 18 hours after receiving notice, 1,200 Fort Ord troops were on the way to Honduras in Operation Golden Pheasant. This was soon followed by Operation Nimrod Dancer, in which another 990 Fort Ord soldiers were sent to Panama to strengthen American security forces. A major action of this new Light Division occurred in December of 1989 during Operation Just Cause. The 7th Infantry deployed over 6,000 troops from Fort Ord to Panama to protect the Panama Canal and to apprehend General Noriega. January 31, 1990, the operation was complete and the soldiers returned to Fort Ord. These years of drills and rapid deployments permeated the fabric of Fort Ord's existence until the Base Realignment and Closure Commission ordered the post closed. It became law in October of 1991. In August of 1990, however, Iraq invaded and occupied the Emirate of Kuwait. As a result of this unprovoked attack, President George Bush initiated a mobilization of the reserve component forces of the United States. 21 U.S. Army Reserve and Army National Guard units mobilized at Fort Ord from August through November 1990. 19 of the Reserve and National Guard units, along with 4 active component units, were deployed to the Middle East, again validating Fort Ord's readiness as a mobilization station. The liberation of Kuwait was successful, and Fort Ord soldiers were able to return by mid-year 1991. But Fort Ord's mission was not quite over. In May 1992, its soldiers were called upon to help restore order in Los Angeles in the wake of the riots that city endured. And later that same year, the 571st Military Police Company deployed to Somalia in support of Operation Restore Hope. In August of 1993, a final inactivation ceremony was held. And because Fort Ord accelerated its environmental and unexploded ordnance cleanup, Fort Ord was declared a model for base closure. Colonel Thomas F. Elzey, Jr., Fort Ord's last commander, comments on this cleanup.
Environmentally speaking, Fort Ord is a very complex habitat. Number one, there's 44 endangered species on Fort Ord, both plant and animal. That alone makes it a very unique setting. Add to that the unexploded ordnance concerns, and those are safety concerns, not environmental, of cleaning up the impact area in places where soldiers trained and use those weapons of war. In many cases, we're several years ahead of schedule. In the case of UXO, we're just beginning. We've cleaned up about 90% of the affected lands outside the 8,000-acre impact area, and we'll begin the cleaning of the impact area probably in about 6 months. And that'll be a 10-year process.
The first land transfer of Fort Ord's property occurred on July 8, 1994, when Secretary of Defense Perry and Assistant Secretary of the Army Walker passed transfer documents to officials from the California State University and the University of California. September 30th, 1994, the U.S. Army garrison at Fort Ord was inactivated, and the post was closed.
The life of a unit is sustained as long as the colors are preserved. The senior non-commissioned officer of each command is responsible for the safety of his unit's colors. As the senior non-commissioned officer on Fort Ord, Sergeant Major Richard Higdon will take the garrison colors from the color bearer and present them to the commander, Colonel Tom Elzey. The commander's last act is to case the colors. The official orders read, General Order, Washington, D.C. Effective 30 September 1994, Fort Ord is closed and placed in an inactive status. Effective 30 September 1994, the United States Army Garrison is disestablished. By order of the Secretary of the Army, Gordon R. Sullivan, Chief of Staff. Upon completion of casing, Colonel Elzey will present the colors to his commander, General Reimer. General Reimer will then return the colors to the safekeeping of the Command Sergeant Major. The casing of the colors is the final traditional act in the inactivation of the United States Army Garrison and the closure of Fort Ord as an Army installation.
Gathered at this historic event was the great-great-great-granddaughter of General O.C. Ord.
He spent a lot of time in California, especially following his time here in Monterey with Sherman. He went down to Los Angeles and he did a lot of surveying, a technique which he learned at West Point as a cadet there. He did a survey for laying out the city of Los Angeles, referred to as La Ciudad de Los Angeles at the time. We have an old family story that says that following the survey, General Ord was offered either $300 for his services or 3 square blocks of what is now downtown Los Angeles. And he laughed and said, the real estate in this town will never be worth anything, so he took the $300. It's not one of our proudest family stories, but we claim it's true anyway.
The final chapter in the closure ceremony of Fort Ord would not be complete without closing comments from General Dennis J. Reimer, Commander of Force Com, and Colonel Thomas F. Elzey, Jr., the last commander of Fort Ord.
Fort Ord stands as a monument to those dedicated Americans who trained here, who worked here, who served here, who fought and died to keep the United States Army strong and America free. People like General Vinegar Joe Stilwell, Private Martinez, and the 14 other Medal of Honor winners that served here. The light fighters. There's a certain spirit about Fort Ord. You can see it, you can feel it. I don't think I'll ever come to Fort Ord where I won't hear the familiar hoo-ah that echoes throughout the terrain. I think it's permanently emplaced in those sand dunes behind me. I want to thank the community at large. You have been a good neighbor. You have put up with us, you've loved us, and you supported us. We will never forget you. You will always be a part of us, and we hope that somehow we will always remain a part of you.
I had absolutely no previous ties to Fort Ord when I arrived here 14 months ago. But I've come to feel a true kinship with the post, its history, its people, and the surrounding communities that have so generously embraced us. I have a keen awareness of what boarded up buildings, deserted streets, vacant motor parks, and the missing sounds of soldiering means to the old-timers of Fort Ord. It is a grand day when communities can welcome back their troops and this land to civilian roles. It is a sure sign that peace has been won. It is my honor and my privilege to pass Fort Ord on to this new destiny. But my greatest honor has been to serve with each and every one of you. I salute you.
The sounds of marching boots and cannon's roar are stilled, but for the thousands of soldiers that pass through its gates, the memories of Fort Ord will remain forever. Hear the words of Colonel Elzey at the final placement of the drill sergeant statue.
I think this is by far the most fitting position for this statue to end up with. He's had more on-post moves than any soldier at Fort Ord, and hopefully this is his last one. We've enlisted the help of 10 or 12 stars to make sure the drill sergeant stays here looking out over the beautiful Monterey Bay. I think this memorial is very, very meaningful to each and every soldier that's has ever walked through the fields of Fort Ord. without a doubt, when you come back to a post that's been closed, you need a place such as this to come back to sit and reflect, regardless of your rank, regardless if you're in the Army or DOD civilian or just visiting. You need a place to go back to and say, where was Fort Ord? What was it all about? And I think this fine spot commemorates that very, very well.
To all those whose lives were entwined with Fort Ord's heritage, we salute you.